Rogue Record.
What's up, everybody? You're listening to Hustle Makes It Happen, a podcast about the grit, the determination, and the mindset that it takes to become a winner. Success is not an accident. It lives outside your comfort zone, in the trenches, where excuses are met by brick walls. So strap in, tighten up, and let's get ready to hustle. What's up, people? Welcome back to another sprint from Hustle Makes It Happen, the podcast. As you'll notice, I'm trying something a little different this time, trying to get a little creative and doing some virtual podcasting. So bear with us if this isn't working out, but we think this is going to really elevate our ability to bring better guests in front of you and get more content out in front of you a little bit easier, trying to streamline the operation. This is just part of that. With that out of the way, today what we want to talk about is something that we all face in anything that we're trying to chase in life, and that is overcoming fear. And that comes in a lot of different styles, right? Fear comes in a lot of different forms and faces, and it looks different for everybody, but it could be fear of what other people might think of you. It could be fear of failing. It could be fear that you're not good enough personally, fear that you don't know what you're doing, so you're afraid to get into it. But I can tell you from experience that the number one thing that keeps people from pursuing their goals is fear. And I want to note before we kick off into it that this topic came from a friend of mine that watches the show routinely. So like I said, if you guys have some ideas that you want us to talk about, shoot them over to us in a text or IM or whatever. But this is a viewer suggested topic of overcoming fear. So how do you do that? How do you overcome fear in your everyday life?
Yeah, I like how you mentioned that fear looks different to everyone. All those different types of fear that you just mentioned, I think I've felt at one time. The fear of people thinking about you in a weird way. If you like starting a podcast was kind of a thing that I was kind of afraid about. I don't know how people would look at it with me sitting behind a mic, and didn't know if I was good enough to be trying to put out content. So you really kind of hit the nail on the head that, fear comes in very different forms and fashions, and it's different for everybody. People who have families, their fear is going to be a little bit different when it comes to diving into like a business venture, because they have to put food on the table for their family, versus someone who is maybe fresh out of college or decided not to go to college, that doesn't have any responsibility. They may have a fear of failing, but it's a lot different than that person that's got to put food on their table.
Well, dude, if you think about it, like the reason we have fear to begin with is because it's a protection mechanism, right? If you think all the way back to like the biological roots of what fear is, it's a protection mechanism. It's a thing that is built into us at a human, the most minuscule human level to protect us from things going wrong. So it's very hard to fight against that. But what I've found, and I know whenever we started our business, me and my wife both had a huge amount of fear because it was financially risky, right? But I think instead of looking at this is where a lot of people go wrong. I think instead of looking at the bad outcomes of what could happen in that situation, you have to look at the good you have to consider the good outcomes, right? What if it does work? And there's a podcast that I like to listen to called "What If It Does Work." If you listen to that and you think about that message, that's how you overcome that fear. You think about, the fear derives from being in a spot where you're unsure about the future, and it's this protection mechanism to keep you from making bad decisions, right? But whenever you have fear, what you're thinking about is all the things that could go wrong in your endeavor, right? And you're trying to protect yourself against that. But to turn that coin and get on the other side of it, you have to think about, man, what happens if this does work, right? What happens if this financial gamble that I'm taking pays off? Does it outweigh the risks of the potential negative side if it doesn't, right? And that's a really, really challenging thing to do. But if you're talking about overcoming it, I think that's the play. You got to look at the upside of it.
Right. And you got to, obviously there's going to be some points where you have to kind of analyze the risk and look at the benefit risk, ratio there and see, is it actually worth taking this endeavor? Sometimes fear can be healthy. But I think in most situations, and what we're kind of, right. But I think what we're kind of talking to is more so the person that's probably taking a risk that's worth a reward, or kind of shying away from a risk that's worth the reward. And I think it becomes probably the biggest obstacle in everyone's life is fear. That's the wall, the first wall you have to break through. Because if you don't ever get through that wall or face that wall or try to, see what's on the other side, then you're going to be in the same spot you are now. And that may be a great spot for 10, 20 for the rest of your life. You have to face that wall before you can find out what's on the other side.
Yeah, that's right. And another thing you kind of touched on a few minutes ago was, and we talked about this on the Caffeine Concepts episode we did with Brandy. You remember that one where she was talking about that one, and the one we did with Tori Acord, where she was talking about fear of like what other people might think of you, and having what they call it, imposter syndrome, right? Overcoming imposter syndrome. I think that was a huge thing that for me at least was very true. And I think it affects a lot of people, is like you're genuinely afraid of what other people might say about what you're trying to do, or afraid that the things that you're saying aren't going to resonate with certain people. And the way that I've overcome that just in the last couple of months was kind of tuning all that out as noise and really focusing on the people that are telling you that you're helping them with whatever you're doing. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like overcoming imposter syndrome is another type of overcoming fear. It's another fear. That imposter syndrome is like, you don't feel like you're good enough to talk about things. You don't feel like you have the experience or the knowledge to talk about things. And again, to overcome that, it feels like such a cop out to say, but like, you just got to kind of plow through it. Just like everything else we talk on the podcast. Like you have to break that first wall, like you just mentioned, to go see what's on the other side.
100%. And I think as far as the fear of what other people may think, you're going to face people not agreeing with what you're trying to do. If you're trying to make a change in your life, if you're doing really anything out of the norm, people are going to be trying to tell you, oh, well, I wouldn't do that because, Billy Bob Joe's cousin from the other side of the family tried that and it didn't work out for them. Or telling you, just people who are not going to be supportive of you taking that business venture. If you believe in yourself, don't even listen to that unless it's sound advice. And I think it's okay. I think it's pretty easy to filter out sound advice versus people just trying to stop you. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, that's the way I feel about exactly what you just said. Like I've had people in my life routinely that I'll ask something to, and they'll tell me it might be a bad idea. And look, sometimes they're right. Sometimes you're not making good choices. You're just making a bad decision. But a lot of times, if I feel strongly about something, or I feel very passionate about something, or I'm very confident that we can pull something off, I'll bounce it off a couple of people as a sounding board. But whenever I get that, the cautious feedback or some of that, people instilling some of that fear in you, I'll listen to that. I'll take that feedback and write it down as like a risk to whatever I'm trying to do, and then still go do the thing. Like whatever that endeavor was, I'll still go do it, but I'll have that risk kind of written down and identified and then mitigated going into it. And that really helps alleviate some of the fear, because I can see kind of around the corner of what other people have experienced and what I can expect.
Yeah. And I think that feedback you get, it's good to take some of it into consideration, or really all of it, and just kind of lock it down or jot it down somewhere and say, hey, these are some of the risks that I need to assess. But it's just like when you're in school, if you're looking for sources to write a paper, the last site you're probably going to go to is Wikipedia, because pretty much all colleges and professors are like, no, this source is from Wikipedia. That's not even relevant. Right. And you need to decide who's your Wikipedias, who has not actually had experience with whatever endeavor you're trying to, set forth into. If they have not experienced it or dealt with the ups and downs and the trials and tribulations of that experience, they might be your Wikipedia. If you want to start a painting company or a construction company, and you have somebody who is a teacher telling you, oh, well, you shouldn't start a construction company or, a contractor company because of this and that. Well, they haven't experienced it. They haven't been through all the trials and tribulations and had to break down those walls. So maybe let's try to seek out somebody who has experience with that and go ask their advice. And, what would they do differently? But it's good to take, I guess, all of that negativity and feedback you're getting into consideration, but consider your sources,
Yeah. Look, you said this a while ago and I totally agree with it. I think fear, like some level of fear, is healthy. Like you have to have that, right? Like that's like I talked about right at the beginning. That's your protection mechanism. So that's what's kind of keeping your spidey senses tingling and keeping you out of trouble. So you have to have some level of fear. People that, whenever my friend asked me to do this episode on fear, this episode is not on how to be fearless. Like that's not the point.
Right.
You have to have a level of fear, right? You have to have some level of risk identification and mitigation strategy in place in your life. What we're talking about is how you really, like I'm boiling it down to the military because that's what I'm familiar with. Like you identify risk, you generate controls, you implement controls, you make risk decisions, right? And then you evaluate, make sure everything went well. I probably just butchered that. So if you're very familiar with the Army's risk management process, don't hammer me on that. But that's the basic steps, right? Like look at what could go wrong, come up with safeguards to put into place, and then go forward even if the plan is risky, right? You still go forward even if the plan is risky, but you have to spend the time on the front end mitigating the risk that you can see. I think that's kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think you make a good point because, a lot of people use the saying risk it for the biscuit, and that can work. But I think that there's too much of a luck, factor involved with that. So it is good to analyze your risk, to figure out what, like you said, identify what your risk is, and then determine if you can afford that risk. If it's going to make you lose your house, like maybe we shouldn't take that risk. Yeah. But if you can afford that risk, then all right, how can we mitigate it? Like, what can we do?
What controls can we put in place? Right.
Right. Can we leverage money somewhere to like start this business? And, if leveraging that money is not going to break me, then, okay, well, maybe I can take that risk and still put food on the table if it doesn't work out. But if it does, guess what? We just broke through that wall and we're going to find out what's on the other side.
Yeah. I think, now that we're talking through it, I think a better synopsis of this episode is not how to overcome fear. It's how to leverage fear for positive outcomes. You know what I mean? But I don't think overcoming fear is necessarily a wise thing to do, right? I mean, you have to overcome the fear to take the first step. I get that. But instead of just throwing, like, you don't want to be reckless and careless and throw all your fear to the side and just plow through. Like that's a bad play. That
can end a disaster.
Yeah. So I think a better way to look at fear in general is not how do I overcome fear, is how do I use my fear to implement safeguards that are going to keep me from failing to the best extent possible, right?
Yeah. I like where you went with that. That's pretty much on point. I don't really know if there's a whole lot more to say about it. It's just
sum it up like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So look, guys, don't worry about overcoming fear. And I'm using finger quotes. Don't worry about overcoming fear, right? Use your fear to help you plan for better strategies and outcomes. That's the play. Understand that you still have to move forward in spite of fear if you want to be successful in anything, but use that fear on the front end to generate solutions and solve the problems that you see. Like, use your fear in a valuable and positive way instead of in a way that keeps you from taking that step, right? Understand that you have to take the step anyway. So
before I have one more point.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Fear, if you think about it, fear really, it's kind of to your advantage, right? Because if fear was if it didn't exist, everybody on planet Earth would be taking every opportunity known to man because they're not afraid of it, right? So fear is actually your ally because it kind of keeps the playing field small. So you're only competing against a few small select people that are willing to address that fear and take that fear, whatever your market is or whatever your business is. And you can use that as your driver because fear is going to push you to do things that you never probably thought you would be able to do or that thought were possible. So it really, if you look at it, it depends on the angle of attack, but you can look at fear really as a super value asset for you, a very valuable asset.
Yeah. Well, I think the people that are the most successful, that's exactly what they do. Like instead of being crippled by fear, they take their fear and they figure out a way to mitigate risks. Like, cause that's what fear is, right? Fear is a risk. Like there's a risk and you are afraid of it. But the people that are successful and how people separate from, success or not success is that the ones that are successful, take that fear, they look at the risk, they address the risk, and they move forward, right? The ones that are not successful look at the fear. They don't do a good assessment on the risk. They don't put mitigation strategies in place. And then they ultimately just either move forward and fail or don't move forward at all.
Right.
So I think that's I think that's the kicker. Like, don't worry about overcoming your fear. Figure out how to leverage it into something useful. I think that's the mic drop point, right? Don't worry about being fearless and overcoming your fear. Embrace it and learn how to leverage it for positive outcomes.
I like it.
Boom.
Knocked it out the park.
That's the thing on fear. And it took a turn because I wanted to talk about overcoming fear. But then the more I sat here and thought about it, the more I realized that it's not really about overcoming it at all. It's about leveraging it, identifying risk, putting mitigation strategies in place, and moving forward in spite of it.
Yeah. And here's a great example of why you need good people in your life, positive influences, because me and Justin both came into the conversation today. Even if nobody will listen, we learned something from it just by bouncing ideas off of each other.
That's right.
Go find yourself a good group of people to keep yourself surrounded with. I'm telling you, the value is hard to put a number on.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody at church. We're sidebarring at this point, but I don't care. I was talking to somebody at church this morning and they were like, man, love the podcast. Love what you guys are doing. Oh, it's Sunday, by the way. So I was at church earlier. But one of the guys was like, man, I've been watching, love what you guys are doing. I like hearing that kind of stuff because it keeps telling me that we're going in the right direction. But I told him, I was like, dude, it's just as much for us as it is for everybody else. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I get something out of every one of these episodes that we do. And that's why I don't ever want to quit doing it. And we're trying to, like, this virtual podcast stuff is our attempt to keep it going at whatever, however we can. And that's what life is about, guys. It's about identifying obstacles and figuring out how to overcome them. We're having schedule conflicts. Chase is not able to be with us fully right now. He'll be back, his normal high-spirited self before long, but he's just not ready right now. So we very easily could have just put the podcast to the side, but we didn't want to do that. So we identified the obstacles. We came up with a couple of different solutions, and we're just trying whatever fits. And I think that tenacity and that drive is what is going to help us be successful in the long run. At least I hope so. Right.
I feel like we kind of go ahead.
I was going to say the other side of that is that we quit, right? We're just done and we quit.
Right.
And it's over.
I think we're kind of going the same ways. Yeah. We leverage the fear of quitting and the fear of it. And then this way, it was kind of what people would think. Like, we started this podcast and all of a sudden we just gave up on it. I have a fear of that. Like, what would people say about, oh, what happened to the podcast? Oh, well, it got too hard. Yeah. Well, isn't that what your entire podcast is about?
That's right. That's what we preach about. Right? We preach about overcoming obstacles and figuring it out. So that's exactly what we're trying to do.
We leveraged that to come up with this option, the remote option. Justin's a 40-minute drive for me, and it's an hour and a half drive in, and then another hour at his house doing a podcast on every Sunday is just really not ideal. It's not the best situation. So we adapted and overcame, and hopefully this trial run goes well, because this would be a game changer for us, and we can bring other guests in as well.
Yeah, and let us know in the comments if you guys mind, right? If you hate this, or if you love it, or if you don't care, either way. Let us know, because I think this is the way of the future. This is the path forward, at least in the short term. Man, we still want to get in front of guests in the actual studio, because I think I get a lot more value out of being like face to face with somebody, because there's a lot of conversation that happens before and after, right? That you don't really get to see on camera, and I think there's a lot of value in that too. But without belaboring the point, let us know what you guys think about the virtual option. If you're listening on audio, it probably really doesn't matter to you at all. But if you're watching on video, let us know. That's it.
Yeah, I figured this is a podcast and not like a YouTube channel. I mean, it is, right? But like, it's a podcast, so it doesn't really matter what we look like in front of the camera at the end of the day.
That's right. No, but that's it, guys. That was a viewer suggestion, a long-term, loyal, faithful friend of mine, Bottom of the Boot Farms, ripping the merch. Nice. My boy Cody. Yeah, my boy Cody over at Bottom of the Boot Farms. And he's a hustler, man. We're going to have to get him on the show. Dude goes by, he started calling himself Chicken Daddy.
Chicken Daddy.
Yeah, he started a little homestead farm at his house, and it's a little subdivision, but it's awesome, man. He's got a little worm farm, and
nice.
Now he got chickens and a bunch of little animals running around. But yeah,
that's
Chicken Daddy.
Right there.
Yeah, my man. But no, Cody suggests that we talk about overcoming fear, and I'm really glad we did, because I think I learned that it's not really about overcoming fear. It's about leveraging it to turn it into something positive.
Absolutely.
And that's it. That's it, guys. That's another sprint from Hustle Makes It Happen, the podcast. Remember, until next time, keep your head down, keep your eye on the ball. Hustle makes it happen. But most importantly, have fun. Later.